Story 1. The Shadows of Eldridge Bay. In the remote coastal town of Eldridge Bay, summer was a time of paradoxes. By day, the sun cast its golden glow over the sleepy town, inviting tourists and locals alike to bask in its warmth. The beaches were a sanctuary of soft sands and gentle waves, a place where time seemed to slow down and the troubles of the world melted away. But when night fell, Eldridge Bay transformed into something entirely different, a place where the shadows stretched long and dark, and the whispers of the past seemed to echo through the narrow, cobblestone streets. For locals like Emma Kavanagh, Eldridge Bay had always been home. She had grown up in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, just a short walk from the rugged cliffs that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. Her parents had owned the local bait shop for as long as she could remember, a modest business that served the fishermen who braved the waters each day. Emma had spent countless hours exploring the tide pools and caves that dotted the shoreline, her love for the sea as deep and unyielding as the ocean itself. But as much as Emma loved her hometown, she couldn't deny the strange and unsettling feeling that had begun to settle over Eldridge Bay that summer. It had started with the hushed conversations between the older residents of the town, exchanged over coffee at the diner or in the dimly lit corners of the local bar. They spoke of disappearances, of strange lights flickering in the woods, and of the unsettling silence that seemed to fall over the town as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emma had dismissed the rumors at first. After all, every small town had its share of ghost stories and urban legends, tales meant to scare the kids and entertain the tourists. But when her childhood friend, Sarah Miller, vanished without a trace one hot July night, the whispers became something much more sinister. Sarah had been one of the most popular girls in town, smart, kind, and always ready for an adventure. The night she disappeared, she had been out with a group of friends, enjoying a bonfire on the beach. Emma had been invited but had declined, feeling a bit under the weather after a long day at the bait shop. She had said goodnight to Sarah with a promise to catch up the next day, never imagining that it would be the last time she would see her friend. When Sarah didn't return home the next morning, her parents called the police. A search party was organized, and the entire town turned out to comb the beaches, woods, and cliffs in search of any sign of her. But despite their best efforts, no trace of Sarah was ever found. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The town was shaken to its core. Everyone had loved Sarah, and her disappearance cast a dark shadow over the normally carefree summer months. Parents kept a closer watch on their children, and the once lively beaches were now deserted as soon as the sun began to set. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and with them came the fear that something evil was lurking in the shadows of Eldridge Bay. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sarah's disappearance than anyone realized. She had known Sarah better than anyone, and she couldn't believe that her friend would have just wandered off without telling anyone where she was going. And then there were the dreams, vivid, terrifying nightmares that began haunting Emma soon after Sarah vanished. In the dreams, Emma found herself standing on the edge of the cliffs, staring out at the ocean as the wind howled around her. The sky was dark, filled with swirling clouds, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. And then she would see a shadowy figure emerging from the water, its form indistinct but undeniably menacing. The figure would raise its arm, beckoning her to come closer, and despite the terror that gripped her heart, Emma felt an almost irresistible pull to step closer to the edge. Every time, just as she was about to take that final step, Emma would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She would lie awake for hours afterward, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as the sun began to set over Eldridge Bay, Emma made a decision. She couldn't ignore the dreams any longer, couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She had to know what had happened to Sarah, and more importantly, she had to understand why the dreams were haunting her so relentlessly. With a sense of determination that bordered on desperation, Emma packed a small bag with a flashlight, some water, and her father's old hunting knife, a relic from his younger days. She told her parents she was going to visit a friend and promised to be back before midnight. They didn't question her, too caught up in their own worries about the shop to notice the anxiety that lingered in their daughter's eyes. As darkness fell, Emma made her way to the cliffs. The wind had picked up, whipping through her hair and carrying with it the scent of salt and seaweed. The path was familiar to her, one she had walked countless times as a child, but tonight it felt different, foreboding, as if the very earth beneath her feet was warning her to turn back. But Emma pressed on, her footsteps steady as she climbed higher and higher, until she finally reached the top of the cliffs. The view was breathtaking, as always, with the ocean stretching out endlessly before her, its surface glittering under the light of the moon. But the beauty of the scene was marred by the dark thoughts that plagued her mind. She stood there for a long time, staring out at the water, waiting for anything to happen. The minutes ticked by, and just as Emma began to wonder if she had been foolish to come here alone, she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. Emma, the voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it sent a chill down Emma's spine. She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there, only the empty, windswept cliffs. Emma, this time, the voice was louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the edge of the cliff, just beyond where Emma stood. Her heart raced as she took a hesitant step forward, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the very edge of the cliff, its form barely distinguishable from the night itself. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the figure was facing her, its eyes, if it had eyes, fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Sarah, the name slipped from Emma's lips before she could stop herself, but even as she said it, she knew that the figure before her was not her friend. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that sent a wave of primal fear coursing through her veins. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words, and then it took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Emma wanted to run, wanted to turn and flee from this nightmare, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground, her body paralyzed by a terror she had never known before. "Emma, come closer." The voice was unmistakable now, no longer a whisper, but a clear, commanding tone that seemed to echo inside her mind. It was Sarah's voice, and yet it wasn't. There was a darkness to it, a malevolence that made Emma's skin crawl. She shook her head, trying to break free from the trance that held her. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." The figure took another step forward, and as it did, the clouds above parted, allowing the moonlight to illuminate the scene. Emma gasped as she saw the figure clearly for the first time. It was Sarah, but not as she had known her. The girl standing before her was pale, her skin almost translucent, and her eyes were empty voids, black as the abyss itself. "Emma, join me. Emma, join me." The words were like a knife to her heart, cutting through the last remnants of her resolve. Emma felt herself being drawn forward, her body moving of its own accord as she took one step, then another, toward the edge of the cliff. No, the scream tore from her throat, a desperate cry that echoed across the cliffs and out over the ocean. Emma forced herself to stop, digging her heels into the ground as she fought against the invisible force that was pulling her closer to the edge. "Emma," the voice was a hiss now, filled with anger and frustration. The figure that had once been Sarah began to change, its form shifting and warping as it grew larger, more menacing. Its arms stretched out toward her, fingers like claws ready to drag her into the darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, Emma broke free from the force that held her. She turned and ran, sprinting back down the path as fast as her legs would carry her. The wind howled in her ears, and she could hear the creature behind her, its footsteps pounding against the earth as it gave chase. Emma didn't look back. She didn't dare. She focused on the path ahead, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed herself to keep going, to outrun whatever nightmare was pursuing her. The path was treacherous, the rocks slick with dew, but Emma didn't slow down. She could see the lights of the town in the distance, a beacon of safety that urged her onward. Just a little further, just a little longer. And then she was there, bursting out of the woods and onto the streets of Eldridge Bay. The creature's footsteps stopped abruptly, and the oppressive weight that had been bearing down on her lifted. Emma stumbled to a halt, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She turned to look back at the path she had just fled, half expecting to see the creature standing there, waiting for her. But there was nothing, only the dark, silent woods, as if the nightmare had never existed. Emma didn't go home that night. Instead, she went to the police station and told them everything about the dreams, about the figure on the cliffs, about what she had seen. They listened patiently, their expressions a mixture of concern and skepticism, but Emma didn't care if they believed her or not. She knew the truth, and that was enough. The search for Sarah continued for weeks, but no new leads emerged. Eventually, the town of Eldridge Bay began to move on, the whispers fading into the background as summer turned to fall. But Emma never forgot what she had seen that night on the cliffs. She knew that whatever had taken Sarah was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And as much as she tried to push the memories away, the nightmares continued to haunt her, a constant reminder that some things are better left in the dark. Story 2. The Haunting of Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek had always been a place shrouded in mystery and folklore. The small town, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was a place where the past clung stubbornly to the present, where the dense woods seemed to whisper secrets to those brave enough to listen. For generations, the town's history had been marked by strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, eerie lights flickering in the forest, and the ever-present feeling that something was watching from the shadows. For as long as he could remember, Dylan Reeves had been fascinated by the stories of Hollow Creek. His grandmother, a lifelong resident of the town, had been a wealth of tales, spinning yarns about haunted woods and restless spirits every time Dylan visited her old farmhouse. As a child, these stories had both terrified and thrilled him, sparking a deep curiosity about the unknown. Now in his early 20s, Dylan was studying journalism at a nearby university. When his professor assigned a project on local legends, Dylan knew exactly where he wanted to go. Hollow Creek was the perfect place to explore for his article, and he was eager to dig into the town's dark history. He packed his car with notebooks, a camera, and a few essentials, and made the 2-hour drive to Hollow Creek. The town was much as he remembered, quaint, with narrow streets lined with old houses, their paint peeling and windows clouded with age. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth, and the mountains loomed on all sides, creating a sense of isolation that was both comforting and unsettling. Dylan's grandmother, Ruth, was thrilled to see him. She was in her late 70s now, but still as sharp as ever, with a keen memory and a twinkle in her eye that hinted at the many stories she still had to tell. As they sat on the porch of her farmhouse, sipping sweet tea and watching the sun dip behind the mountains, Dylan explained his project and asked if she could help him with his research. Ruth smiled, her weathered hands folding neatly in her lap. "Oh, I've got plenty of stories for you, Dylan," she said. "But there's one in particular that I think you'll want to hear. It's about the old Asher house." Dylan's ears perked up at the mention of the Asher house. He had heard bits and pieces about it over the years, but never the full story. The Asher house was an old mansion that stood on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades. It was said to be haunted, though the details of the haunting were vague and varied depending on who you asked. "Tell me everything," Dylan urged. Leaning forward in his chair, Ruth nodded, her expression growing serious. The Asher house was built back in the early 1900s by a man named Elias Asher. He was a wealthy industrialist who made his fortune in coal mining. The house was his pride and joy, a grand, three-story mansion with all the finest trimmings money could buy. But it wasn't long after he moved in that things started to go wrong. Ruth paused, her gaze distant as she recalled the story. It started with small things, strange noises in the night, doors opening and closing on their own, cold spots in the house. But then it got worse. People in town said they saw lights in the windows at all hours, even when no one was supposed to be home. They heard screams coming from the house, and Elias himself was seen wandering the grounds late at night, muttering to himself. He became reclusive, refusing to leave the house or see anyone. "What happened to him?" Dylan asked, his voice hushed. "No one knows for sure," Ruth replied. "One day, he just disappeared. Some say he went mad and ran off into the woods. Others believe he was murdered, but his body was never found. The house has been empty ever since, though a few people have tried to live there over the years. None of them stayed for long. They all said the place was cursed." Dylan felt a chill run down his spine. The story was exactly the kind of thing he was looking for, but it also filled him with a sense of dread. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. "Do you think it's really haunted?" he asked. Ruth looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I've lived in Hollow Creek all my life, Dylan, and I've seen things I can't explain. I don't know if the Asher house is haunted, but I do know that there's something not right about that place. If you're planning on going there, you need to be careful." Dylan nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring his grandmother or himself. "I will," he promised. That night, Dylan lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced with thoughts of the Asher house. He had planned to start his research by visiting the town's library and speaking to some of the older residents, but now he was tempted to go straight to the mansion itself. The thought of exploring the abandoned house, of uncovering its secrets, was too enticing to resist. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, Dylan set out for the Asher house. It was a clear, crisp day, the kind that made the colors of the world seem more vivid. The drive to the mansion took him down a winding road that led deep into the woods, the trees growing thicker and more imposing with each passing mile. Finally, he rounded a bend and saw it the Asher house. The mansion stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown hedges and towering oaks. Time had not been kind to the house. Its once grand facade was now cracked and weathered, the windows dark and empty. The roof sagged in places, and ivy crept up the walls, as if trying to reclaim the structure for the earth. But even in its dilapidated state, there was something undeniably majestic about the Asher house, a lingering sense of its former glory. Dylan parked his car and got out, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he approached the front door. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, and the silence was so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He reached for the door handle, hesitating for just a moment before turning it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Dylan stepped inside, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. The foyer was vast, with a grand staircase leading up to the second floor and a chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. Dust coated every surface, and the air was heavy with the smell of mold and rot. As Dylan ventured further into the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a whisper in the stillness. He snapped a few photos with his camera, trying to document the eerie beauty of the place, but his hands were shaking, and the images came out blurry. The rooms were a jumble of old furniture, cobwebs, and peeling wallpaper. Each one told a story of neglect and abandonment, of a home that had once been filled with life, but was now nothing more than a decaying shell. In the parlor, Dylan found a grand piano, its keys yellowed and chipped. He ran his fingers over them, producing a discordant, haunting melody that sent shivers down his spine. As he made his way through the house, Dylan's sense of unease grew stronger. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But the house remained silent, empty, as if waiting for something. Finally, he reached the top of the staircase and stood in the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The air was colder up here, and a faint draft whispered through the cracks in the walls. Dylan paused, his heart pounding in his chest as he considered whether to continue. But the pull of the unknown was too strong, and he steeled himself before opening the first door. The bedroom was a small, claustrophobic space, with a single bed pushed up against the wall and a dusty mirror hanging on the opposite side. The sheets on the bed were yellowed with age, and the floor was littered with debris. But it was the mirror that caught Dylan's attention. It was an old, ornate piece, its surface tarnished and cloudy. As Dylan approached, he saw his reflection staring back at him, distorted and ghostly in the dim light. But then something changed. The reflection began to shift, to ripple, as if the glass were made of water. Dylan took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he thought he saw something else in the mirror, another figure standing behind him, its face obscured by shadow. He spun around, but the room was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, the image had returned to normal, showing only his own pale, frightened face. His mind racing, Dylan left the bedroom and continued down the hall. He opened each door he came to, finding more empty, decaying rooms, but nothing that explained the strange vision in the mirror. Finally, he reached the last door at the end of the hall. This door was different from the others, heavier, more imposing, with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the gloom. Dylan hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle as a sense of foreboding washed over him. But he had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room beyond was larger than the others, with a high ceiling and tall, narrow windows that let in slivers of pale light. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with dusty volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. A large four-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its canopy draped with heavy, moth-eaten curtains, but it was the figure in the corner that made Dylan's blood run cold. A man stood there, his back to Dylan, staring out one of the windows. He was dressed in a tattered suit, his hair disheveled, and his posture rigid, as if he had been standing there for a very long time. The air around him seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself were warping in his presence. "Excuse me," Dylan said, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge Dylan's presence. Slowly, with a sense of growing dread, Dylan approached him, his footsteps silent on the dusty floor. When he was just a few feet away, the man finally turned around. Dylan gasped, stumbling backward as he took in the man's face, or rather, the lack of it. The man's features were blank, smooth skin stretching over where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out, only a hollow, suffocating silence. The faceless man began to move toward Dylan, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he were being controlled by invisible strings. Dylan backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, but the man was relentless, closing the distance between them with each step. In a blind panic, Dylan turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway and back down the stairs. He could hear the man behind him, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, echoing through the empty house. Dylan didn't stop, didn't look back, his only thought to get out, to escape this nightmare. He reached the front door and flung it open, bursting out into the daylight with a gasp of relief. The fresh air hit him like a wave, clearing the fog of terror that had clouded his mind. He stumbled to his car, fumbling with the keys as he tried to unlock the door. Finally, he managed to get the door open and threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him several tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, Dylan didn't waste a second. He floored the gas pedal and sped down the driveway, leaving the Escher house behind. As he drove away, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faceless man standing in the road. But there was nothing, only the empty, winding road and the trees that seemed to close in around him. When he finally reached his grandmother's farmhouse, Dylan was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He parked the car and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. He knew he had seen something in that house, something that defied explanation. But he also knew that he had to get out of Hollow Creek, to put as much distance between himself and the Escher house as possible. That night, as Dylan lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the faceless man. The image of that blank, featureless face haunted his dreams, and he woke up several times, drenched in sweat, convinced that the man was in the room with him. The next morning, Dylan packed his bags and told his grandmother that he had finished his research and needed to get back to school. Ruth seemed to sense that something was wrong, but she didn't press him, only giving him a long, thoughtful look as he said goodbye. As Dylan drove away from Hollow Creek, he felt a strange mix of relief and regret. He had come looking for a story, and he had certainly found one, but the cost had been higher than he had anticipated. The Escher house would forever be etched in his memory, a place of darkness and fear that he would never forget. And though he would never return to Hollow Creek, Dylan knew that the town and the faceless man would always be a part of him, a shadow lurking at the edges of his mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Story 3. The Curse of Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor had stood for centuries, its dark silhouette looming over the small town of Ashmore like a brooding sentinel. Nestled deep within the dense forests of the southern countryside, the mansion was a relic of a bygone era, its history steeped in mystery and tragedy. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning outsiders to steer clear of the cursed estate, where the spirits of the past were said to roam its halls, seeking vengeance on the living. For Clara Evans, the stories surrounding Blackwood Manor were nothing more than local folklore tales meant to scare children and entertain tourists. As a seasoned historian, she had spent years debunking such myths, focusing on the cold, hard facts of history. So when she received an invitation to visit the manor and examine its extensive library, she couldn't resist the opportunity. The invitation had come from the estate's current owner, Mr. Reginald Blackwood, a reclusive man in his late 60s. According to the letter, Mr. Blackwood had inherited the manor from his grandfather and was eager to have someone catalog the collection of rare books and documents that had been gathering dust in the library for decades. The promise of rare historical texts was enough to entice Clara, and within days, she had packed her bags and set off for Ashmore. The drive to Blackwood Manor took Clara through miles of winding country roads, the landscape gradually becoming wilder and more untamed as she approached her destination. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. By the time she reached the gates of the manor, a thick fog had rolled in, casting an eerie pall over the surroundings. Clara hesitated for a moment before driving through the open gates, the wrought iron creaking ominously as they swung shut behind her. The long driveway was lined with ancient oak trees, their gnarled roots breaking through the cracked pavement. As she rounded the final bend, Blackwood Manor came into view, its Gothic architecture imposing and foreboding against the gray sky. The mansion was a sprawling structure, with multiple wings and turrets that jutted up like jagged teeth. The windows were dark and empty, and the stone walls were covered in patches of ivy, giving the impression that the house was slowly being reclaimed by nature. Clara parked her car in the circular driveway and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the oppressive silence. As she approached the front door, it swung open with a creak, revealing an elderly man standing in the entryway. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt and lined with age. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, taking in Clara with a keen intelligence. "Miss Evans, I presume?" The man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes, that's right," Clara replied, extending her hand. "You must be Mr. Blackwood." The man shook her hand briefly before stepping aside to let her in. "Please come in. I trust your journey was uneventful." "It was," Clara said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into another world as she crossed the threshold. The interior of the manor was as grand and imposing as the exterior, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and intricate chandeliers that cast a dim, flickering light. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, leather, and something musty and ancient. Mr. Blackwood led her through a series of dimly lit hallways, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone floors. As they passed by, Clara couldn't help but notice the portraits that lined the walls, stern-faced men and women in period clothing, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked by. Finally, they arrived at the library, a vast room filled with towering bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The shelves were crammed with books of all sizes, many of them bound in leather and covered in dust. A large, ornate desk sat in the center of the room, and a fireplace crackled in one corner, its flames casting a warm glow over the space. "This is the collection," Mr. Blackwood said, gesturing to the shelves. "It has been in my family for generations, though I'm afraid it hasn't been properly catalogued in quite some time. I trust you'll find what you're looking for." Clara's eyes widened as she took in the sheer volume of books before her. "This is incredible," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "There must be thousands of volumes here." "There are," Mr. Blackwood replied. "Some of them quite rare, as I'm sure you'll discover. I'll leave you to your work then. If you need anything, my staff and I are at your disposal." With that, he turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Clara stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the library, before setting down her bag and getting to work. She had brought her laptop and a few notebooks, and she quickly set up a makeshift workspace at the desk. The hours flew by as Clara delved into the collection, losing herself in the pages of the old books. Many of the volumes were in Latin, French, or other languages she was only somewhat familiar with, but the challenge only fueled her excitement. She found several first editions of historical texts, as well as numerous journals and letters that provided a fascinating glimpse into the lives of the Blackwood family over the centuries. But as the day wore on, Clara began to notice something strange. The atmosphere in the library seemed to change, growing colder and more oppressive. The fire in the hearth, which had been crackling cheerfully when she started, had died down to embers, and no matter how much wood she added, it refused to catch. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, creeping across the floor and walls as the light from the windows dimmed. Clara tried to shake off the feeling of unease, chalking it up to fatigue and the unfamiliar surroundings. But as she reached for another book on the shelf, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. Startled, she pulled back and looked more closely. There, hidden between two books, was a small, ornate key. It was old and tarnished, the metal worn smooth from years of use. Intrigued, Clara took the key and examined it closely. There was something about it that felt familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. Her curiosity piqued. Clara began searching the library for a lock that the key might fit. She tried it on several cabinets and chests, but none of them yielded to the key's touch. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she noticed a small door in the corner of the room, half hidden behind a heavy curtain. The door was much smaller than the others in the house, almost child-sized, and made of dark wood that matched the paneling on the walls. It had no visible lock or handle, but there was a small keyhole in the center, just the right size for the key Clara had found. With a sense of growing anticipation, Clara inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked smoothly, and the door creaked open on rusty hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Clara hesitated for a moment, her instincts warning her not to go any further. But the allure of the unknown was too strong to resist, and she found herself stepping through the doorway and onto the first step. The air grew colder as she descended, the faint light from the library quickly fading as the door swung shut behind her. The walls of the staircase were rough stone, slick with moisture, and the steps were narrow and uneven. Clara had to move slowly, one hand trailing along the wall to keep her balance. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a small circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, much like the library above, but these shelves held only a few scattered objects: a cracked mirror, a rusted dagger, and a collection of old, leather-bound books. But it was the object in the center of the room that drew Clara's attention. A large wooden chest sat on a stone pedestal, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light of the single torch mounted on the wall. Clara approached the chest cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The carvings depicted scenes of death and destruction, battles, executions, and dark rituals performed under a blood-red moon. She could feel the malevolence emanating from the chest, a palpable force that seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. With trembling hands, Clara reached out and touched the lid of the chest. The wood was cold and smooth, and she could feel a faint vibration running through it, as if something inside was alive and waiting. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But her curiosity was too strong, and before she could stop herself, she lifted the lid. The moment the chest was opened, a gust of icy wind erupted from within, extinguishing the torch and plunging the room into darkness. Clara stumbled back, gasping as the cold air wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud. She could hear whispers all around her, faint and indistinct, but growing louder with each passing second. Terrified, Clara fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. The chest stood open, its contents shrouded in shadow. But as Clara moved closer, she could see something glinting in the light, a small blackened stone sitting at the bottom of the chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as Clara reached down and picked up the stone. It was cold to the touch, almost painfully so, and as she held it in her hand, she felt a surge of energy course through her, filling her with a sense of dread and power. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single, terrible voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber. "You should not have come here." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she looked around, trying to find the source of the voice. But there was no one there, only the darkness. Pressing in on her from all sides, the voice spoke again, this time more forcefully. You have awakened the curse. It cannot be undone. Panic surged through Clara as she realized the gravity of her mistake. She had meddled in something far beyond her understanding, something ancient and malevolent. Desperately, she tried to put the stone back in the chest, but it was as if her hand had frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. The darkness around her began to swirl, coalescing into a figure that towered over her, its form shifting and writhing like a mass of shadows. Eyes like burning coals glared down at her, and a mouth filled with jagged teeth twisted into a cruel smile. "You belong to me now," the voice hissed, the figure's form solidifying as it reached out with long, clawed hands. Clara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The figure's hands closed around her, and she felt herself being pulled into the void, the stone still clutched in her frozen hand. The world around her dissolved into a whirl of shadows and pain, and the last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was the sound of the chest slamming shut. The next morning, when Mr. Blackwood entered the library to check on his guest, he found the room empty. Clara Evans was gone, and there was no trace of her belongings or the work she had done. The small door in the corner was closed, the key still in the lock, but the library was eerily silent, as if it had been untouched for years. As Mr. Blackwood stood there, he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, deep down, that Clara had awakened something in the depths of Blackwood Manor, something that had been waiting for centuries to be freed. The curse had claimed another victim, and the manor would continue to stand as a monument to the darkness that lay within. And though the world outside moved on, those who ventured too close to Blackwood Manor would feel its presence, a malevolent force that whispered of forgotten horrors and lost souls, forever trapped in the shadows of a cursed legacy. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.